Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization dedicated to peace, economic and social justice, good government, and a clean environment. One way of achieving that mission is listening to experts discuss pressing local, national, and international issues. Before COVID struck, concerned citizens met regularly to hear these experts. After COVID arrived, concerned citizens turned to Zoom, video recording talks, panels, and debates for later broadcast on this channel. Now that COVID is in remission, our main menu is again in-person meetings. But for those of you unable to join us, Village TV is video recording our in-person speakers for later broadcast on this program. In addition, when the right opportunity comes along, Concerned Citizens Presents will continue to offer the occasional remote speaker. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. My name is Suzanne Modell, and I serve on the committee responsible for these broadcasts. Each broadcast is devoted to a pressing social problem, and surely America faces few more pressing problems than gun violence. Actually, in preparing for this program, I was surprised to learn that the U.S. does not rank first on the planet in shooting deaths per capita. Several Latin American and Central American countries rank higher. But among wealthy countries, it most certainly does. Shooting deaths per capita are about 10 times higher in the United States than in the next highest wealthy country, which is Switzerland. As for stricter gun laws, 1/3 to 1/2 of Americans oppose them, along with more than half our politicians and a supermajority of Supreme Court justices. In the face of such strong opposition, how can we make America safer? Today's guest is well suited to address this question. Christian Heyne is Vice President for Policy at the Washington office of the Brady campaign. The Brady campaign is an organization founded after Jim Brady, press secretary for President Reagan, was seriously wounded during a 1981 presidential assassination attempt. That nightmare motivated his wife, Sarah, and later Jim himself, to join other Americans in demanding that people purchasing handguns pass background checks. In 1993, their efforts bore fruit when Clinton signed the Brady bill. Unfortunately, neither this nor subsequent legislation has adequately protected Americans from gun violence. Hence, the work of the Brady campaign continues. Christian Heyne was born and raised in Ventura County. In 2009, he received a bachelor's degree from Cal State Chico, where he founded the Chico State chapter of the Brady campaign, the first of its kind. Since graduating, he has spent most of his career working to reduce gun violence, for instance, by encouraging laws that remove guns from persons with a history of violence, or by promoting ordinances that require gun owners to report lost or stolen weapons. Christian will speak for about 15 minutes, after which he will take questions from our small but committed audience. Christian.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction and for having me on today as a guest for the program. I am so thankful to the folks who have gathered here to have this critical conversation. And I think it's conversations like these that have fundamentally shifted the way that people are talking about gun violence and the solutions to gun violence that are necessary in order to really fix a uniquely American problem that we experience here because of our unfettered access to weapons. And I'm excited to dig in on that conversation, to talk about what's within the realm of possibility, and to really describe the ways in which we can continue to build the kind of foundation necessary to tackle what is a public health epidemic of gun violence in the United States. As stated, my name is Heyne. I am the Vice President of Policy at Brady. And Brady is an organization that works across courts, communities, and Congress with gun owners and non-gun owners alike to take action, not sides, to really fight the American problem of gun violence. I'm really proud to work at this organization. Just like it was mentioned earlier, I come to this movement in a way that far too many Americans come to this movement in the same way. In 2005, my parents had spent a holiday vacation together. They spent a weekend, and they had borrowed a boat from my dad's best friend. They spent some time in Big Bear in California, getting sunburnt on the lake with our 2 golden retrievers. And they really had a couple days for their record books. When they came back to return that boat at the end of Memorial Day weekend in 2005, a man lay in wait who had aspirations of killing my dad's best friend. And because my parents were there, the gun was turned on them as well. This gunman came up the driveway. He recognized my dad's best friend. He shot my dad's best friend right in the stomach. Then he turned the gun on my father. My dad got shot, and whether or not he was running for his life or was trying to get the gunman away from my mother, this gunman continued to pursue my dad, and he shot my dad 2 more times. My dad, presumably this gunman thought that he was going to die, so he turned around, and my mom hadn't run away. Neighbors said that she was keeping Steve alive. She was putting pressure on his wounds from his gunshot. And the last words she ever spoke were, as she begged for her life, she ran about 10 steps and was shot and killed with a single bullet to the back. This gunman went on to terrorize our community. He went on to bludgeon a mother to death in front of her 2 kids. He broke into this home. He put both those kids in the intensive care unit. He fired at the father of this family, shot and wounded a police officer, ultimately took his own life in a Walmart in Simi Valley. We just couldn't understand how this happened. And frankly, some of this was because of our own ignorance to the porous laws that exist in this country. We thought that we lived in a community that was safe from gun violence. And the reality that we learned is that as long as we as a nation allow our gun laws to be as porous as they are, and allow the kind of unfettered access that we experience here in America, we can have no expectation of safety. Gun violence is something that is tearing too many communities apart. And frankly, shame on us as well, because we know that there are too many communities where they don't have the luxury of thinking that gun violence isn't a problem. Too many communities that are experiencing gun violence at horrific rates, disproportionate to communities like the one I grew up in. And oftentimes these are communities of color. These are Black and brown communities where there are root causes that when addressed, you can have substantial differences. You can have an effect on gun violence through investment and through other innovative public health approaches. And we just don't do anything as a nation to try to stem the violence that occurs every single day in this country. So we got to work. We started learning more and more. And as you mentioned, Suzanne, I got involved with my local chapter in Southern California of the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence. At the time, there were a number of incredible survivors that had been doing this work for a long time. And they helped me find my voice as an advocate and as a advocate for change. I went to school in Northern California near Sacramento. I learned from more survivors who are responsible for so many of California's strong gun laws, more than 100 that have been passed in the time that they've been doing it since their daughter, Laura Wilcox, was killed, and have fundamentally shifted and have made it so that Californians are exponentially less likely to be shot because of the policies that have been passed in that state, in your state, that than people who are living across the country in so many other states, communities, and places. California experiences gun violence at a much lower rate per capita than states with far weaker laws. And so what we learned is that if you pass strong common sense laws, you can have an impact and prevent the kinds of tragedies that we experienced from taking place in the first place. And I moved to Washington, D.C. I became the legislative director for the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence for about 10 years. And now I am incredibly humbled and excited to be able to oversee our state and federal policy program here in Washington, D.C. But look, I have got to tell you, in the 17 years that I've been doing this work, for so much of that time, it has been a lonely space. There have been chunks of that time, especially from 2005 to about 2012, where I just couldn't understand what it would take for Americans to say enough is enough and we have to change our laws. California kept leading on it. We kept seeing the results. And still, after mass shooting, the daily toll of gun violence that was taking place in far too many communities, and just the sheer numbers of gun violence in this country compared to every other industrialized country in the free world. We just experienced gun violence so much exponentially worse when you look at the numbers adjusted for population than any other industrialized country that exists. And what happened was all of this violence was accumulating. It was happening over time. People were recognizing it, seeing it, saying there's just nothing that can be done. And the horrific shooting that took place in 2012 in Newtown, Connecticut, where 20 children and 6 educators were slaughtered in an elementary school. It was a moment in time when Americans said, we cannot keep doing this anymore. You know, shame on us that it took that long, but thank goodness that everybody has banded together and said, we don't have to live this way. As a result, in that time period, sure, change has not happened quickly. We famously failed to get a vote in 2013 to enact universal background checks, in large part because a minority of senators utilized a procedural filibuster, by the way, that President Barack Obama called a relic of the Jim Crow era because it was so effectively used to prevent civil rights laws from passing during the civil rights movement. Similarly, prevented a policy that more than 90% of Americans supported. Just think about that. At the time, you have a bill where all we are saying is that when somebody purchases a weapon from a stranger or otherwise, they have to go through an instant background check. On average, these, over more than 90% of the time, take less than 2 minutes. This is something that gun owners, non-gun owners alike, gun owners, 82% of them supported this policy at the time. 74% of NRA members supported this bill at the time. And still, they could not surpass the votes necessary to overcome the procedural filibuster. And as a result, that bill didn't pass. But what happened was, in states throughout the country, people refused to stop. And we passed landmark policies year after year after year. States like Virginia, that was one of the worst states in the country when it came to gun laws. When Virginia Tech happened, they proactively worked to fix their record-keeping system. That was a huge first step. But then still, the gun lobby was fervent. The NRA is headquartered in Virginia. And over time, those survivors of gun violence, day in and day out, kept showing up. And over time, specifically in that period between 2010 and 2017, they fundamentally changed the politics in that state. So no matter what party you're a part of, you better be good on guns or you will pay. And ultimately, they flipped the House of Delegates in Virginia simply because of the gun issue, because the Republicans had a special session at one point in response to a horrific shooting in Virginia Beach, and Republicans gavelled in and gavelled out after only 45 minutes. So that very next election, guns was on the ballot. The number one issue that voters were coming to the table to talk about was guns. And as a result, they were able to functionally change that legislature, and they passed a resounding series of policies that are going to fundamentally change the way that guns are exchanged hands, not only in Virginia, but up and down what is known as the 95 corridor, the Iron Pipeline, where guns easily travel from states with weak gun laws to states with strong gun laws. So look, I look at what has happened in the last 10 years, and I'm still blown away of what we've seen this year. We have plenty to be nervous about. The Bruin decision by the Supreme Court certainly is going to change the way that we think about state laws, certainly going to change the way that we approach our gun laws. But also, we saw in the US Senate, a group of bipartisan legislators come together and pass not the perfect gun bill that's going to end gun violence, but pass a really strong bill that will save lives. And this is a bill that has provisions.
I don't understand.
That has provisions like the dating partner loophole, which was a provision that prevented the Violence Against Women Act from being reauthorized for years. And Senator Joni Ernst was one of the vocal opponents of that policy, saying, as long as this gun provision is embedded in the Violence Against Women Act, I won't vote for it. And only a couple months later, she voted for this package of bills that not only had the closing of the dating partner loophole, but a number of other policies that are going to be effective at saving lives. This is a bill that Senator Mitch McConnell, voted for, even though for years he has been a stalwart opposer of any kind of reasonable gun legislation that even NRA members and Republicans support across the board. That didn't happen, overnight. It didn't happen because all of a sudden there was a change in the ethics and morals of the folks in the US Senate. What happened was a concerted and consistent presence from Americans of all backgrounds, Democrats, Republicans, gun owners, non-gun owners, relentlessly calling their legislators and say, you have to do something. You have to do something different. And that steady drumbeat calling for action, demanding that we do something differently, is why this bill was able to pass. Now, we still have a long way to go. This bill that was just passed in the US Senate, the starting point of those negotiations were that universal background check bill was off the table. To me, that's unacceptable. There are too many Americans that support so many policies we still desperately need. But what I will say, we cannot get to a place where we pass those bills, where we pass a bill to strengthen and expand the Brady background check bill. We cannot pass all of the policies we need to address gun violence in all of its forms, right? In communities of color, for firearms suicide, for domestic violence, all of the elements where firearms make these incidents so much more lethal. We can't do any of those things without this first step. And without all of the other steps that have been happening slowly and consistently for the last decade, we would not be where we are today, and we can't get to where we need to get tomorrow. So I'm happy to dig in here a little bit. I'm happy to take some questions and to talk about what we can do. But I will tell you, I have been doing this work for 17 years. When I first got into it, my mantra was that if we could just prevent one family, one incident of gun violence from taking place, one community from undergoing the trauma that my community went through, that I went through, that my loved ones went through, and by the way, not only that we went through, but we continue to go through every single day. If we could do something for that one person, that one family, it will have all been worth it. And we know through research, through epidemiology, through the study of the gun laws that places like California have collectively passed, and other states across the country, that we're having that impact. And not only that, by the way, that folks on both sides of the aisle are desperate to see it happen. So at the end of the day, I'm going to be an optimist on this issue. And while I know that the road is long, and it's none of it's a given, it can be really daunting. I do think that we are going to get to a place where we will win, and where we can bring common sense back into the legislation and the way that we regulate firearms in this country. I believe that. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, well, thank you. Actually, you've answered some of my questions, so I think actually what I'll do is I'll have some of our guests go first, and then if I still have some remaining thoughts, I'll share them. So Sarah Weaver is a lawyer and an expert on this matter, and she's actually responsible for our having Christian as a guest. So I think that we should let Sarah go first. What kinds of questions would you have for Christian?
Well, Christian, I'd like to have you talk a little bit about some of the community violence intervention programs that are going on in some of the cities with high crime rates, because that's a different approach than legislation. And it's really, from what I read and what I understand, reaping significant successes in certain places. So could you talk a little bit about those programs, and maybe also the hospital intervention programs?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to give a major shout out. I'm so happy to be on here, but in particular with Sarah, who is such a pioneer and incredible advocate and leader in gun violence prevention. Her work in the legal field on these issues, litigating cases against the gun industry, the work that you have done is really the foundation of so much of the work that we do, Sarah. And I'm so honored to be on this program with you today. I am really excited about the work that's being done, and frankly, the investments that are being made in what we call community violence intervention programs or community violence initiatives. This comes in a lot of forms. The base idea is essentially, how do we take a public health approach to gun violence, which really is an epidemic, and a lot of the things that we've done in the past has been to lean into criminal justice practices that really are not rooted necessarily in evidence of efficacy, or that they're having an impact. And over time, we have seen actually that higher rates of incarceration in particular communities, which tend to be Black communities, concentrated efforts to over police in these communities and to disproportionately have laws that disproportionately impact specific demographics in our society, particularly Black Americans. That in a lot of ways, this has exacerbated violence over time. It has helped perpetuate cycles of violence that have impacted entire generations of oftentimes urban communities and Black communities that has exacerbated the violence rather than abated it. And so what these programs do, and there's a lot of pioneers in the field that have been doing this work for decades. What it is in order to address gun violence, they can do that through investment. And if you invest in smart ways that address those root causes of violence, there is a long-term positive effect where you can stop and break that cycle of violence. And so the example that you give, Sarah, of one of these kinds of initiatives is the hospital-based violence interventions. And in these instances, if you have, for instance, somebody who is from the community, maybe somebody who has experienced this kind of violence in the past, maybe previously incarcerated, maybe previously a member of a gang, or has experienced violence directly, somebody who is a valid leader within the community, and let's say that they show up in a hospital room where somebody has recently been shot. All too often when somebody is shot, that leads to retaliatory violence. And having that opportunity, that moment for somebody to sit there and tell you, who's been there before, and say, look, the path that you are going on here is only going to lead to more violence or more arrests. And in particular, the likelihood that you are shot, killed, or in prison as a result of this is increasing every single time that these actions continue to take place. Help us help you and show you another way. And by giving people access to opportunities, job opportunities, resume building classes, clubs, recreational spaces to thrive, to tutoring, wraparound mental health services that otherwise they may not have access to, wraparound healthcare that they may not have access to previously. By opening up the doors to these services that so many other communities have access to freely, surprise, surprise, you are able to drive down the demand for the firearms. You're able to drive down the need for individuals to perpetuate the violence, and you can stop cycles in these neighborhoods and have a dramatic effect, because it's not like entire cities are violent. What we know is that it is a very small number of people, and that is even like a small number of people in neighborhoods. And if you can impact a fraction of a percent of these individuals and really make sure that you're honing in where evidence shows us perpetrators of violence are active, and if you can stop that from happening, you can have a dramatic impact for future generations. So it's exciting work. President Biden has committed a historic funding for these violence intervention programs. We saw it in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. We saw it before with a number of one of his first sets of executive actions had 5 different agencies that had 25 different programs that were reallocated to make sure that people could access this violence intervention funding. We saw a lot of American Rescue Plan dollars spent towards this, and I just want to give a shout out too, because I've talked a lot about this. Everything I know about this, I've learned from incredible pioneers, people like Erica Ford, who runs Life Camp in New York, my friends over at the Community Justice Action Fund, which operate as a hub for so many groups, Cities United, Javi, the list goes on and on. There are a lot of incredible Black-led organizations that have been doing this work for a long time that deserve the credit for this work and are making sure that the money's getting in the right hands and the right community leaders so that we can have a direct impact on generational gun violence.
Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you. All right, what about someone else? How about Hassan? Hassan, do you have a question for our guest?
Yes, well, he answered most of my questions, but I think there are 2 things that we should consider. One, the universal background check. And the other one, that there should be a cooling period, that you order a gun or you want to buy it, wait about a week so you can have some people talk to you whether you need it or not, whether you should have it or not. Those are the questions. And another thing, why do we need our Army grade rifles, or what do they call them, RPGs or whatever? What do we need that for? That should be outlawed.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hassan. And yeah, so we at Brady are, the Brady background check system is the Brady is in the name because Jim Brady and Sarah Brady worked so hard at a national level for so many years to get that bill through. It passed in the 90s, and there's a small loophole in there, just for folks who don't know, that where the industry and folks across the board that are looking to make a profit by diverting guns to the illegal market are able to easily do so, because there are a majority of states out there that don't require background checks between private sellers. The language that they have used that is in that code is that they loosely define what it means to be engaged in the business of selling guns. There's actually no real definition for it, and that has caused chaos, especially with the advent of the internet and gun shows, which are free marketplaces that allow these sales not only to exist, but you allow people to very easily go and find them, particularly people who don't want to go through a background check. We made it very easy for them not to have to. And I absolutely agree with you, Hassan. It's one of the most important things that we can and should do to end gun violence, not because it's going to fix gun violence, right? A background check in a lot of ways is just a first step, but it's because it's the foundation upon which any gun law works, right? It is the foundation upon which any gun law can work, because we can't prohibit people from accessing weapons. We can't, none of the prohibitions will matter. None of the permits and testing that we can put in place, no matter what it is that we're trying to do across the country to prevent access to firearms for individuals in crisis or otherwise who are at risk of dangerous behavior. It can't work without a background check. So I could not agree with you more that that's a critical first step. And then also, right, we have.
Could I interrupt before you answer the rest of his question? I have just a follow-up question my question would be, what is the probability of passing universal background checks from two angles? One is, how do gun owners feel about it? I mean, it's important. In other words, if you're any law, we can think it's as desirable as we want, but in order for it to pass, we're going to have to get the kind of blitz that you just described went on. So gun owners are, I don't know, about a third or so of Americans. So how do they feel about background checks, universal, as Hassan said? And secondly, what about the Supreme Court? So given its current views and what it has already expounded, would universal background checks be compatible with their view that any law has to meet the text of the test of being in the framers' intention of the Second Amendment?
Yeah, great questions. And look, I mean, I think that your first question is clear cut, right? Gun owners, non-gun owners alike overwhelmingly support universal background checks. And I'll tell you why. It's because most gun owners go through background checks to buy guns. You will find a vast majority of law-abiding responsible gun owners might not even know that background checks aren't required for all gun sales, because they've never had to seek out a private sale in which they don't go through a background check, because there is nothing to fear for most law-abiding gun owners. There's nothing to fear of a background check. So, we see consistent polling around this. Usually support for universal background checks is around 90%. Around gun owners, it's around 82%, and around NRA members, it's around 74%. So we see consistent polling that shows that there's wide support. And we know from the Supreme Court, from the readings and the texts that have both come from the D.C. Heller decision, as well as the latest Bruin decision, that two decisions that I think have upended, by the way, hundreds of years of legal precedent, and our understanding of what the Second Amendment was understood to be a right for. And both those decisions, one worse than the other, upended all of that precedent, really extreme Supreme Court that has allowed that to take place. But even in the wake of these decisions, we feel strongly that universal background checks will continue to be historically constitutional and valid. And in fact, we would argue that most of the laws that we advocate for, that we pass, both in states and at a federal level, would fit within the concurring opinions. Maybe not every single opinion, but certainly with the concurring opinions that came in with that decision. And we're going to continue to fight as hard as we can. I'm saying this all while understanding that Sarah can also answer this far better than I can. But I just, there are a lot of reasons why we have to do everything we can to be vigilant. I would say that one of the most concerning elements of this Supreme Court case is the test that they have associated with it, which is new, and it's going to, courts are going to have to figure some of these things out. We're going to have to try them in real time. And what it really highlights for us is, this was overturned because New York was trying to do everything they could to protect their citizens as fiercely as they could. The policies that we are going to follow up those policies with are going to be strong too. And we're going to make sure that we're fighting really hard for proper screening requirements, proper elements to for them to consider. It will go from may issue to shall issue, so there will be less discretion, but the test at which people can carry loaded weapons in public will be more severe. And it signals to us that the work that the Congress is doing is even more important, because we need to raise that federal floor so that states have to adhere to a stronger federal code of laws in order to protect our citizens from gun violence. So, Sarah, please let me know if I messed anything up there.
No, you did a great job. You did a great job. But, you know, when we're so close to it, it might be reassuring to people to know that in California, we have closed the private sale loophole, and we do have a long cooling off period. And those are two significant reasons why we have such a lower per capita gun homicide rate than in other states. And other states are also have done close the private sale loophole. So there are states where, you know, this has been addressed, and we just have to keep working on it at the federal level. But you did very I'm in complete sync with you on your view of Bruin and Heller.
And I absolutely agree. It's a great point with California, because you're right. I am in the weeds and I'm thinking about it from a national perspective. But I was reading an article in the New York Times just this a couple months back, where because of the body of work that California has done, right, that the laws that California has passed, not only, like you said, the waiting period, the cool off period, the universal background check, requiring background checks for every gun sale, the assault weapons ban that has passed, and so many others, right, that are critically important. If you live in California, you are 40 times less likely to die by firearms than you are on average in the United States. So
Wow.
while California still experiences gun violence at a high level, because Americans do across the board, California is not on an island. The laws that are in California, if you really think about it, when you adjust for population, work dramatically well in concert with one another. So, and a lot of guns are bought and sold in California. You know, I have a lot of gun owning friends in California that have access to a lot of weapons, and that's the balance that we're trying to strike, is how can we ensure that people have access to firearms they need, how their right is recognized by the Supreme Court, but at the same time, there's so much that we can do to protect citizens from the fear of being shot. We have a right and a freedom from gun violence in this country, to live free from gun violence in this country, and that's important to remind folks about as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both. Maybe we move on. Lee, you have some thoughts you'd like to share.
Yes, putting on my public health hat, I came up with 3 questions before your talk. One, I believe you've addressed in part, at least, and that is what I call the angry young men part of gun violence. And that is, men under 35 are the perpetrators and the victims of well over half of gun violence and murders. The second question has to do with suicides. And since suicides account for about half of the gun deaths, at least in the United States, how do we really reduce the number of guns available in homes, since I'm sure that that's mostly the source of those guns? And thirdly, do gun buyback programs really work?
Great questions. And so I'll tackle your first question, which is the angry white male that all too often is a perpetrator of violent acts. Look, and you can almost rope this into the second question as well, around firearm suicide, which, to your point, Lee, 3 out of 5 gun deaths in America are firearm suicides. 3 out of 5. It is a harrowing level of gun violence that is preventable, that is uniquely American, purely because of our access to firearms. The reason why I say that these two issues are linked is because if we take a public health lens and we apply that to policies in a way that informs how they're structured, we can have an impact. And so there is a tool called the Extreme Risk Protection Order. It's the Gun Violence Restraining Order in California. And this is a tool that is aimed at both of the demographics that you're describing there, not because they're trying to have any kind of a broad litmus test that is overly broad and saying, hey, all, white men should not be able to own firearms, right? Because you have the active school shooters, and you have the demographics of people who are more likely to die of firearm suicide, which is older white men. What these extreme risk laws do, though, is they say, well, what's the actual evidence that we have here so that we're not overly broad? We're creating policies that are specifically narrowly tailored towards individuals most at risk of dangerous behavior. And so they asked the experts, and a number of experts in public health provided the research necessary to create the gun violence restraining order. They found that there are no better predictors of future acts of violence than past acts of violence, that drug and alcohol misuse are factors that you can consider, and domestic abuse at large is a huge red flag for future acts of violence. Now, then what they did is they said, okay, so these are factors that that should be considered. Who should consider them? We have to think about due process. And so they modeled a tool to be a civil order that you interact with the courts in order to get. They are modeled after the domestic violence restraining orders that have been found to be constitutional in all 50 states. And they created a system at which they're not trying to create new avenues of criminality, right? And to exacerbate gun violence, like we were talking about earlier, but simply temporarily separate this individual who's at risk of dangerous behavior, because we have all the public health data that shows us that they're at risk, temporarily separate them from firearms. And so the orders last for about, the initial order is 21 days. The final order is about 1 year. Now, the reason why I mention this is because this is a tool that has been found to be very effective at both preventing suicide and preventing mass shootings. Because you have these instances where family members and law enforcement, they know who is at risk of dangerous behavior, but maybe that person hasn't met the criteria of an involuntary commitment, or they haven't met the criteria of a prohibition based on a violent act that hasn't occurred yet. But they know that they're at risk of dangerous behavior because of the evidence around risk. And so in Connecticut, we saw that when these orders were used, about every 10 to 20 order that was issued, at least one suicide was prevented. And then UC Davis had a string of studies in the last 2 years that have showed that a number, since California's GVRO has been in place, a number of people who were respondents to gun violence restraining orders, who were threatening violence, who were at risk of all this dangerous behavior. They weren't arrested. They were separated temporarily from firearms, and those acts of violence were averted. They did not go on to commit these mass shootings, and there's a lot of evidence that showed that a lot of lives were saved as a result. So we can craft policy to balance these issues. Suicide is not inevitable. If you can intervene and prevent a suicide, 90% of the time, people are going to go on to go live long lives and not die by suicide. Our access to firearms makes those moments of crisis irreversible because of the lethality of a firearm. Firearms are only used in about 10% of suicides, but they account for 90% of suicide deaths. There's just no coming back from a firearm, so we've got to address it head on, and we can do so through smart policies like the ones that we're describing here, as long as they're adequately utilized. And then I lost the thread on the third one because I got too amped up about the first two.
Buyback programs.
Buyback programs are a tricky issue. They are a tricky issue. The evidence around buyback programs are tricky because you don't necessarily get the guns out of circulation that you want to get out to prevent those cycles of violence. I think that there are a lot of really important cultural aspects to buyback programs that have been very impressive. There is a wonderful program in Colorado that facilitates private equity. So it's not something that the state is using funds for, because if the state has an option to use funds for anything, I would hope they would use it for community violence initiatives that we know are so effective at reducing gun violence. But if they are using these private funds, they buy the guns and then they turn them into instruments or gardening tools, so that the metal from these firearms can go on to help produce life and produce music and produce culture. And to me, there's an element of this that is cultural. And that's why we've been able to have such effective change recently, and why there is an element to some of these that I would definitely won't say is ineffective, because it's hard to put a stamp on how meaningful that is for future generations to see people turn in their weapons and to see those turned into instruments that provide for the community later on. So I think that there are ways to thread the needle here. I'm not gonna give a one size fits all answer, but I do think that if state governments are investing money into reducing gun violence, they would be much better served to invest in community violence initiatives than they would investing in gun buyback.
Okay, thank you. Finally, Alan, would you like to unmute yourself? There you go.
I'm unmuted. Thank you. Thank you, Sue. Thank you very much for being here today and for speaking. When Lee asked this question, the first thing I thought of is the most famous shootout in American history is the gunfight at the OK Corral. And what that was the police, the marshals, the police force of Tombstone, Arizona, went to take the guns away from people who were entering town, because in 1881, Tombstone, Arizona, it was illegal to carry a loaded firearm in town. So they kind of got it, that the idea of young men, alcohol, and guns don't mix. But I guess if I'm going to append a question to that, it'll just be the first question is, where did we lose the way on that one? It's pretty obvious, but yet we're not there. But my other question, I guess it'll be, they'll be in the West also. There's a big difference in the attitude and also the necessity of owning a firearm or firearms in, say, Los Angeles and Wyoming. There are reasons you might need a firearm in Wyoming, including a pistol, that don't exist in Los Angeles. So I wonder, is a federal approach to this possible? Is there a way, do you believe, to craft some kind of federal guidelines or law which will take into effect these differences? And do you think that would go any way to lessening some people's opposition?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and both points are well received. I think, you know, there's a litany of history around the Second Amendment, around gun ownership, that that highlights just how extreme gun ownership has gotten, to the point that now it is mainstream to hear the blatant lie and myth that the Second Amendment was created for what I would call insurrectionist ideology. Any kind of idea that private citizens' ability to own a gun is tied to their ability to take up arms against the government. It's just not true. If you look at, even before the OK Corral, when the Revolutionary War was won, and the Second Amendment was crafted, right? There was famously Whiskey Rebellion and the Shays Rebellion, two insurrectionist groups that essentially did not want to pay federal taxes. And George Washington at the time, he didn't call upon the U.S. Army to go quell those rebellions. He called upon the state militias, and you'll remember that the Second Amendment is about a well-regulated militia. The militias at the time of the Second Amendment founding, when we start talking about history and what that really meant, the militias were fundamentally different, and it was really that is the group that quelled the people who were sort of taking up arms against the government for what they perceived as tyrannical. Those were insurrectionists, and it was the militias that quelled that uprising. So I think that there's a history of there's a long history of gun ownership, to the point of the NRA for so many years was representing gun owners and hunting rights, and they believed in regulation. They believed in the things that we could do to prevent gun violence. And there was famously a revolt at a NRA convention in the 60s in Cincinnati, where a small group of people ousted the leadership in the NRA at the time, and they decided that they were going to move closer to Washington, D.C. and become far more extreme. And what we have seen over the years is that brazen extremism become mainstream in a way that's horrifying. That if you can draw a direct line from Wayne LaPierre standing on the floor of the NRA convention saying the guys with the guns make the rules, which is inflammatory insurrectionist language, and you can draw a straight line to the violence that we saw on January 6th and the violent insurrection that took place right down the street from where I'm sitting today. I think all of that history is really critically important. Now, your other point's a good one too. Look, I think that so much of the federal policy that we argue for are things that gun owners from every state in the country should agree with. Universal background checks. There are some places in Alaska where it might be a little bit more of an inconvenience because of the amount of land that you have to drive across to get your firearm, but nobody's going to be prevented from buying a gun. And I would argue that most people, when they're purchasing their weapons, are purchasing so through a background check anyhow. And the scourge of gun violence is too great for us to allow strangers to buy guns from other strangers. I've been to a gun show in Virginia. I handed somebody cash. They put a revolver in a paper bag, and I was on my way. And it was a legal purchase. There was no reason for them to suspect that I was a prohibited person. I wasn't. It was a legal purchase, but that was two strangers, cash and carry. And that is a legal transaction in too many states in this country. This does not make sense. But to your point, Alan, there are a lot of things that states and communities should be able to do to address gun violence in those states and communities, right? States should be able to do more than what the federal government. There's a lot of things that the federal government just should do. We should be preventing domestic abusers from buying guns, right? We should be making sure that these extreme risk laws are something that everybody in every state can use. We should be making sure that that background checks are universal. We should be banning the sale of assault weapons and high capacity magazines. These are things that most Americans agree with. These are things that will have a huge impact on gun violence in America, and that will not impact the Second Amendment in any way, shape, or form. But there's additional steps that states should be able to do to be able to say where people can carry weapons. Maybe that is different in LA than it would be in Montana, and that's fine. And we have to give those states and those communities the ability to do so. This Supreme Court, just the decision that the extreme decision that they just made, really makes that much more difficult in a way that is horrific and stands against the Second Amendment and the history of the Second Amendment that we have in this country long term. So it's something we're going to be watching closely. I think both are important, but it swings both ways. Not only do I think that there are some federal laws that we should be raising the floor on, I think that there are state policies and local policies that should be able to be passed to reflect what gun violence looks like in those communities. And we can't do that if the Supreme Court is striking down common sense policies that those states are trying to do through their own sovereignty. And that's an important aspect to this dialogue as well.
Right. Wow. Well, we're nearly out of time. I'm trying to think if I could ask something profound that would kind of summarize the issues that you're describing. From your point of view, from what you understand about the state and the feds, do you think that if Congress passes rules, or both the Congress and the Senate, would the Supreme Court then honor those?
Yeah, I mean, it's the question that we're all trying to grapple with. It's our view that the Supreme Court made a decision very specifically about a very specific policy that implicated about 5 states. In particular, that Bruin case looked at who can and can't carry loaded weapons in public, and in particular, the ability that New York has in having discretion in who those folks are, regardless of a set of facts where 2 people who have the same requirements one can be denied that ability and one can be granted. They struck that down, regardless of the fact that historically that's the way that things have been done. And what is actually the aberration is a slew of states that have passed concealed carry laws that don't require a permit at all and put the public safety at risk across the board. What is important to recognize is that in this decision, it wasn't that folks just agreed with the opinion that Clarence Thomas put out there. That even though there was a majority, 6 Supreme Court justices that signed on to this opinion, they had concurring opinions for a reason. And it's because they wanted to be, these other justices want to be very clear that while we agree with this decision for this law, our justification is different than his. And so we have a gray area that is going to be tested. Either way you slice it, this is an extreme opinion that was wrongfully decided. If you're originalist, if you're a strict constructionalist, no matter how you slice it, this decision was arrived at incoherently in our estimation, or at least incorrectly. But we also feel that so many of the laws that we fight for, so many of the laws that California has on the books, so much of the policies that are passing across the country, that all these could withstand this test. And the laws that can't are the 5 concealed carry laws that all of those states except Maryland still needs to do some work here, and California, one is in process, are adjusting those very specific concealed carry laws to make sure that they adhere to what the Supreme Court has said in this decision.
Right.
So we have time for me to interject one little thing, just one quick little thing. And this is just my own personal bugaboo. We have to always keep in mind the fact that, the federal government's a government of limited power. So the powers that the federal government has used in the past to regulate firearms are the commerce power and the taxing and spending power. And those are the proper and appropriate powers for Congress to use to regulate firearms in this country. And if Congress was willing to do that and to exercise those powers in that area, we'd be very well off. It's the states and the local governments that have what we think of as the public safety power, the police powers, it's called in the cases. And so the public health kinds of efforts and laws, those are properly within the realm of the states. And the federal government can help us by giving us grants and helping us figure out how to implement them perhaps. But really, if each of our levels of government was doing what it was supposed to be doing and doing it best, then we would all be better off on firearms and lots of other issues. Anyway, I'm not sure that the Supreme Court agrees with me necessarily, because it seems as if it depends on the subject matter how far the powers extend or don't extend, and how the conservative majority feels about the subject matter of the regulation. But I just think it's important for people to keep that in mind, and that's one of the reasons why the states have done so many more innovative and effective things in this area, in my opinion.
Fine. Well, you're a bit of an expert too, so we appreciate your thoughts. I'm afraid we are now out of time. So, concerned citizens, thanks, Christian Heyne and Sarah Weaver, for the hope that you've both given us. Really, despite these setbacks, both of you seem to believe that approaches to reducing gun violence can still be passed. And so that's wonderful news for all of us. And concerned citizens, thanks you, our viewers, for spending an hour with us to learn about these new hopeful possibilities. We look forward to offering everyone another informative program next time.